Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Empire Ascendant, 2nd edition, by Jez Cajiao. Narrated by Wayne Mitchell. Lucian reached up and scratched his hair, picking a bit of dried blood free. He grimaced at the reminder of how much he needed a bath. To be summoned before the scion of the Empire in such a state. The scion. Lucian shook his head as he stared down at the dried blood. He picked it out from under his nails and flicked it away over the side. It plummeted from sight as the ship lifted into the air, engines firing hard as she turned. The acceleration pressed him into the top of the wooden barrel he sat upon and made Lucian smile somewhat subconsciously. More than 700 years had passed since anyone could lay claim to the title of scion or any true rank of the nobility. And out of the blue, he sent an airship for a damned creature like him.
"My lord, refreshments?"
The sailor asked nervously, moving closer. Lucian stared at him for a few long seconds before answering. "I'm no lord, but thank you, and thank your captain for me," he said, reaching out and accepting the cloth-covered tray from the nervous cabin boy. He waited as the boy moved away, then carefully twitched the cloth aside, finding a cup of watered wine, dried meat, a good mellow cheese, and thickly cut bread. Lucian looked it over, swallowing hard as he tried to reconcile the last week with the last few 100 years. Only an hour ago, he'd been trying to decide if he'd finally lost his grip on reality, if his mind had actually snapped, or if the great god of light himself, Sint the Righteous, had really reached out in the silence of his soul and ordered him to wait here. The airship that had been flying south had veered slightly and come into land, the captain of the ship coming to greet and make Lucian, the banished, faithless of the Legion, welcome aboard his ship. It had started a week before that, when he'd been deep in the forest hills above Gnormesh, a small, outlying gnomish town, having spent a week tracking the slavers who'd raided it. He had been sitting, close to tears, looking at the small bodies he'd found. They'd clearly tried to flee, using typical gnomish ingenuity to free themselves, and they'd been caught. 2 of the elven children taken had been made an example of to ensure the others would behave. They'd been stripped, tied to bamboo staves, and had been whipped half to death before. Even now, he shook that memory aside, instead recalling Sint's voice coming to him as he rested, waiting the sun out, ready to make the most of his nocturnal gifts. He'd been sitting cross-legged, too furious to sleep, meditating and waiting, old enough to know that pushing his body through the noonday heat, uphill and deep through forests and jungles was a fool's errand. Instead, despite all his urges, he forced himself to rest, to prepare, and that was when the god had come to him. He shivered at the memory. The sudden feeling of divinity, the pressure, and the sure and certain knowledge that the being that appeared across from him, yet inside his mind, wasn't mortal, had been mind-blowing. "I have need of you, my child," the god had said. And Lucian had found himself suddenly no longer sitting cross-legged in a blood-spattered glade. Instead, he was elsewhere. The light-filled cathedral that surrounded them was indistinct, yet still, when he dropped from his unexpected standing position down to his knees, head bent and fist to heart, the grain of the creamy stone felt smooth and solid under his knees. The gentle warmth of a spring day, filled with the distant, worshipful choir and the song of birds mingling with the scent of the sea had overwhelmed his senses, confusing him. "My child?" The voice had come again, and Lucian had panicked, realizing that the god had asked him for something, and he'd been too distracted by the damn world around him to answer. "Lord Sint, I am at your service," he'd barked, recognizing the figure before him from long in the past. Then he cursed himself with a volume before clearing his throat and going on in a more subdued tone. I am at your eternal service, Lord Sint. If I may ask, your commands are, of course, the most important I will ever know. But you wish to free the gnomes that you have been tracking," Sint finished for him, gesturing for Lucian to stand. "I would not take you from fleeing the wrongfully imprisoned. Instead, I will arrange transportation. I have need of you. The realm, the empire, and the legion have need of you, Lucian. So I shall aid you." Sint smiled gently before going on. "When you open your eyes, you will feel my boon. A minor endurance boost will not aid you much, but it will ease your travel, gentling the heat and assisting your feet to find the path of least resistance." Sint had paused as Lucian stood, looking up at the imposing, armored, yet gentle-seeming being. "Believe me, Lucian, I have spoken with Aemon's heir, and he is worthy of your trust and your service. He has need of you, though he knows it not. Free the gnomes, return them to their kind, and travel to my marker. You will be met by those I send." With that, Lucian had simply bowed his head in assent, and when he opened his eyes again, the world was back to normal. The grim, blood-splattered glade reeked anew as his heart swelled with hope, and he saw the two new additions. First was a marker, pulsing gently in his mind, atop a hill some few dozen miles to the north. To the west, a second marker had appeared, and a buff had lightened his steps. He'd stood, the unnatural smoothness of his movements testimony to the hundreds of years of hard work he'd endured. And without a further thought, he'd reached out, gently touching his fingers to his lips, before pressing that kiss to the cold stone of the small cairn he'd raised. That done, he'd turned and set off, moving smoothly from a jog to a run to a full sprint, glorying in the feeling as the world around him blurred with the oppressive heat of the summer's day. Here, in the southern reaches of the continent, and far from the wind's caress, the sweltering miasma was banished and replaced by a gentle spring warmth by the buff instead. As Lucian dug deeper, lengthening his stride and settling into a steady run that he could only maintain for a few hours under normal circumstances, the second phase of the blessing took root in him. As his muscles pumped and stretched instead of feeling the slight strain, he felt invigorated in a way he'd not experienced in long years. He raced down the hill he was on and up the far side of the gully, jumping across the rippling stream and landing easily, feet touching down gently amongst the leaves and moss-covered boulders. Lucian barely left a print before he was off again, passing deer that had burst into startled flight. For hours he ran, simultaneously glorying in the enhancement, yet still he examined the encounter over and over. He did not doubt it at all that it was sent, gone these hundreds of years, mute when the world fell and billions died, cursing the silent gods. Yet now he had returned, and he'd come to speak to Lucian of all beings. The sun fell, and Lucian's heritage took over, enhancing his strength, his speed, and allowing him to see as well in the dark places of the realm as he had in full sunlight earlier. More and more he passed startled animals, leaping across the remnants of camps his quarry had left behind. The hours that came and went before the blessing finally died allowed him to make up most of the days that he had been behind. The sprint that he managed would have been the stuff of legends, had any but the bears and denizens of the forest seen it. But by the time the sun reached its peak again, he slowed. He took a knee, panting, exhausted, and staring across the gentle dip in the hills to the grim sight of 16 slavers dragging 9 chained and beaten gnomish children up the far side. Even at this distance, the filth on them wafted to greet his nostrils, and the scarcely stifled sobs from the children reached his ears, not to mention the ruckus the slavers made. Their kind were always easy to spot, even from a distance. The unimaginative bastards appeared to believe filthy leathers, washed only in the chance crossing of a river or in an infrequent rainstorm, were the ideal garment. The stench made Lucian's instincts bare their bloody teeth. He stayed there, forcing himself to wait while his stamina refilled, drinking lukewarm water, having refilled the canteen an hour before from a forested stream. He swallowed the water gratefully, and the victims he could see would be watered only at dusk and dawn, treated like beasts. Every drop he drank, while needed, was a luxury they would beg for. He watched them struggling up the far side and back into the cover of the trees before judging his recovery was enough and setting off again. He jogged steadily up the far side, maintaining his silence as best he could and drawing his bow from the bag of holding. Shrugging his quiver into place, he tugged the simple arrow free. His experienced fingers sorted the shafts one from another, making sure that the one he selected had a head that, when laid on the bow, would rest on the horizontal rather than the vertical axis. It had been long years since he'd accidentally used an arrow aligned for the vertical gaps in a deer's ribs, instead of the horizontal gaps in a humanoid's ribs, but still, it had been an experience that had stuck with him. As he flitted through the trees, closing the distance and hearing the voices growing louder ahead, his fingers searched, confirming that all the arrows in his quiver were killers. He came to halt behind a gnarled willow, staring down at the laughing slavers as one of their number kicked the small figure's rump, making it cry out in distress. Lucian didn't hesitate further. Drawing the bowstring back, the fletching of the arrow's veins tickled his cheek as he selected his first target, the kicker, and aimed for the junction of his lower back and posterior. The arrow cut the air with a solid thrum before embedding deep into the spine off the scruffy, dark-haired slaver, right where the ass became the back. As the slaver let out a surprised grunt, eyes flying wide, the sudden cessation of control over his lower body made itself known a millisecond before the pain did. "What's up, Jerry? Put your hip out!" one of the other slavers called to him, seeing him tip sideways out of the corner of his eye. As he turned, he caught a flash of movement. Another of the band, a short, bearded man the group relied upon for more complex negotiations, pointed behind them before sprouting an arrow from the eye and collapsing bonelessly. 2 more of the group fell before the fact they were under attack truly registered with them all. The slavers were no strangers to violence. Their line of work required that they be both skilled and ruthless. But the lack of a visible target and the speed of the arrows caused the group to react more slowly than was their norm. "Balsan! Timo, son! Grab the slaves! The rest of you with me!" Red screamed, drawing a rusty sword and racing toward the trees uphill from their position. He let out a low growl as a single man stepped out to the right, and he adjusted his aim, racing in that direction as the man calmly and silently killed another of his men. 5 of them were down, maimed, or dead, and as the first of them, the scout Francis, closed the distance to Lucian, he simply slid the bow into his bag and drew a huge hand-and-a-half greatsword instead. It was old and clearly well used, but the speed with which the dark man wielded it. Francis, the fastest of their number, attempted to dodge, stepping aside as Red had likely seen him do a dozen times. A contemptuous sneer appeared on the slaver's face before the sword shifted. Francis was spitted like a suckling pig, then casually kicked off the massive blade. Lucian roared and let loose the need for bloodshed. He attacked, no longer content with waiting for them to come to him. He raced down at them, the blade held almost negligently in one hand as the other slapped a mace from the air. The enormous blade beheaded Alamoth, the group's cook, then slammed into Grant's upper chest. Grant was a shit-useless guard, slept more than he worked, and farted like an imp with a bad belly. The sword parted him from left shoulder to navel before it was lifted back into the air in a clearly inhuman display of strength. The charge faltered, the screaming Grant spraying blood everywhere as he was shucked like an oyster from the blade. Then Lucian latched eyes on Red. Red's bowels turned to water, barely managing to get his orders out. The glowing blue eyes that glared at him were terrifying, and Lucian had used them to instill fear in the heart of many a foe. "We'll kill them!" the shaking slaver managed to say before swallowing and trying again. "Stop! Or we'll kill them!" he tried again. We can share! Just stop! Then those eyes were right before him. Lucian flung the sword with a blur and unerring aim to flip end over end, pinning Balsa onto a tree. They didn't even need a weapon. Lucian slapped Red's one-handed axe aside with enough force that half snapped. The other hand tore the shield Red had strapped to his left arm free, a crack ringing out as the twin bones in his forearm shattered. Before Red had time to register it, Lucian drew back and stiffened the fingers of his right hand into a blade of bone. Then he rammed them into the slaver's stomach, punching through the flab that coated the once rock-hard abdominal muscles, angling upwards. Red gasped in shock and pain, eyes going wide as Lucian drove his hand upwards, searching, until he found what he wanted, gripping the slaver's spine from the inside. The clearing seemed to hold its breath as Lucian and Red stared into each other's eyes from a space of a few inches. "Please!" was all that Red managed to get out. Lucian ripped a fist-sized chunk of Red's spine free, dropping the slaver's leader to the floor. The victim grunted, his torn and quivering diaphragm refusing to draw a breath as he attempted to close the yawning wound or move his lower half at all. Lucian stared at the remaining two slavers, 4 having fled into the woods already, and he casually threw the section of their leader's spine aside before pointing a single, gore-coated finger at the one closest to the slaves. "Touch them, and I'll make this far, far more painful," he warned. One of the men nodded frantically, holding his sword and shield wide apart and shaking as he backed away. The other, nervously licking his lips, glanced from Lucian to the slaves, to the bodies, then made the last mistake he would ever make. He lunged forward, grabbing the nearest, a small girl child of perhaps 7 years of age. He lifted her, turning to where he'd last seen the figure, raising his dagger toward her neck, planning to threaten her life to get free. Instead, he screamed as his right arm snapped halfway down the length of his forearm, the shattered ends jutting free in the humid afternoon air as Lucian seemed to materialize before him. He had a split second to register bright blue eyes and pointed teeth as his own blood sprayed across him. Then fingers locked around his throat, yanking him upward and in close. The slaver dropped the weak, struggling child. A pained gurgle was the only sound that could escape the vice-like grip on his throat as he was slammed into the floor. His knees were shattered. A booted kick was all it took before a cold and distant voice told the children to cover their eyes. The slaver was rolled onto his front, his remaining whole arm stretched out behind his back, and a boot braced in his armpit as his throat was released. He drew in a deep breath and screamed in pain and fear as the figure tore his arm from the shoulder socket with inhuman strength. "Call for them," Lucian said as the slaver stared in disbelief, his lifeblood spraying from the torn flesh that was once his shoulder. "Call for them!" Lucian barked again. "Let them know what's coming!" "Timur!" he screamed, then the sound was cut off by his rapidly descending former favorite arm.
My lord?
The voice came again, and Lucian blinked, shaking his head free of the memories and glancing at the cabin boy again. "What?" he asked, confused.
The captain? He asked for the pleasure of your company for the evening meal?"
the boy asked. Lucian stared at him, still waiting for someone to recognize him and tear this long, desperately desired civility and inclusion away from him. I would be delighted," Lucian whispered, the screams of the slaver still ringing in his ears. The forced civility that even the gnomes had greeted him with upon returning their children made him fear this veneer of kindness would be stripped away again soon. He swallowed hard, then forced himself to his feet. At his nod, the boy smiled and gestured to the captain's cabin, and the scent of hot roast beef floating free. Prologue. "Explain yourself, paladin!" the archpriest snarled, sitting back on his iron throne and glaring down at where Edward knelt in supplication before him. "The Dark Hunters are the best option, archpriest, lest we let loose 1,000 or more men from the city." "Not possible," Archpriest Thaddeus Barrowman waved his hand. "It's taken the church over 200 years of dedicated work to undermine the nobility. We finally have the full Barabbaratus handing over authority in the city, and now you think I'll remove the elites from it to deal with one lucky upstart over my dead body? An upstart who managed to slaughter half the Legion," Edward ground out through gritted teeth. "Bah!" Thaddeus shook his head. "He slaughtered the fodder. That's what they're for, need I remind you?" "He didn't just slaughter the fodder. He killed over 10% of the elites as well, not to mention 15 blessed with the dark gifts of the temple." Edward raised his flashing eyes. "He and his people have been both skilled and lucky, and unless you'll allow me to take a large enough force to dig them out of the tower they call home, then I need the Dark Hunters. The Dark Hunters require a significant investment, both in time and in mana, not to mention custom-built armor. No, there is no other way," Edward snarled. "He literally turned one of our best against us. He's the champion of one of the elder gods, and he's gaining more and more forces every day. You know what he's doing, don't you? When we buy slaves and make them into fodder, elevating only the very fortunate few, he's freeing them all. They worship the ground he damn well walks on, according to those we captured. They'll not only die for him without hesitation, but more importantly, they'll live for him as well." "That makes little sense, Paladin," one of the priests who stood subserviently to the side reproached. "Surely them dying for him is far more important." "You would think that, wouldn't you, Wrecker?" Edward shook his head. "Shows how little you actually understand the slaves." "They're animals, that's all," Wrecker shot back. "They're people," Edward retorted. "People who lost everything. They fucked up and it cost them their future. Now all they have left is their lives." He shook his head, willing his hands to stop shaking. "Giving that up? It's no great hardship, even in battle. After all, how many bodies are lost to Washout Cove every week? We deliberately let the slaves throw themselves off the cliffs to weed out the weakest." Spittle flew from Edward's mouth. "That's how they choose death. The strongest seek life, and once they are given the chance to live, they become not only incredibly loyal, but powerful. Think about it. Those who simply exist always end up as fodder. But the strongest of the elites, they all have one thing in common. They were all slaves."
"Foolishness!"
Rekka snapped back.
"Wasn't your own protege one of the slaves? The one who turned his back on the god and attacked us? Having led our forces into the battle and positioned them for the ambush to do the most possible damage. Explain this, Paladin! Explain how your supposed favorite was actually a spy and you had no idea!"
"Thomas had the potential to be one of our greatest assets, priest, and he'd had the dark gift in its entirety within him. Regardless of what he'd wished, even if he'd intended to betray us, it would have been impossible. Unless, of course, you're suggesting that God wished him to do just that."
"Of course not!" Rekka shook his head violently.
"In that case, please, Rekka, explain to the rest of us how Thomas managed to leave the Citadel without being assessed, healed, or having his connections to the god replenished. After all, it was your job."
"I passed the duty to an under-priest," Rekka snarled, a glint of fear in his eyes immediately swallowed up by aggression. "As you well know, Edward, no priest can deal with all the thousands of calls on our time each day. Or do you fight every battle yourself? Why would you have soldiers in that case?"
"Exactly, Rekka. You pass the job on. And that under-priest ordered another, even lower priest, who sent one of the accursed light god's priests to do it. He was a priest who had no authority to request the dark ceremony be performed. Had he even bothered to do the healing or testing that you were ordered to carry out?" Edward practically hissed at the now visibly nervous priest. "Had you done your damn job, there would have been no way for any of this to happen. Thomas would be either a pile of torn muscle rotting in the forest, or still loyal, and the apostate would be dead. Instead, we're short on fodder, unable to devote even a fraction of the necessary resources to deal with the issue at hand, and might I remind you, it is Nyman's will that we kill that fucker." The last echoes of Edward's shout hung in the air as the priests watched each other. The archpriest glared at the paladin before Edward finally continued. "We are left with two choices. First, we appeal to the god for time, build up our forces, and consolidate our grip on the city of Hymnal. We pull in the entire Dark Legion force from the Citadel and any roaming patrols, secure the city, and purge it of any and all who oppose the god's will. Then we round up those who serve no honorable purpose, and we begin their training." Edward glanced around, assessing the responses to that option, then went on. "When this succeeds, we can develop the city into an engine for the church, turning out supplies and equipment until we have a suitable army, complete with airships and more. This shouldn't take more than 3 years, but certainly there's no way to have it done before a minimum of 6 months have passed."
"Impossible! Why?"
"No, you can't be serious. Silence!" The archpriest roared, cutting off the priest as their muttering escalated.
Go on, Edward, he growled. Or, Archpriest, you permit the formation of the Dark Hunters of Nime.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?